and welcome to our special coverage of the 2021 federal budget. I'm Donna Friesen. This budget has been a long time coming, 762 days to be precise, which is more than 2 years. That's when the last federal budget was brought down. And at 4 p.m. Eastern Time today, just after the markets close, we'll find out what Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland has planned. She has called it one of the most significant budgets of our lifetime, and there is a lot at stake. The pandemic, now more than a year old, is still raging. Of course, the situation, as we know, in parts of Canada, especially Ontario, worse than it has ever been. Yes, vaccines are here, which is something that was, only a dream a year ago, but they are not rolling out fast enough. And people whose jobs don't allow them to work from home and who live and work and commute in close contact with other people who don't have paid sick leave are getting sick now. Never in modern times has Canada faced a challenge like this, and today's budget is expected to provide more money to help communities through the immediate crisis. We are also expecting an ambitious plan to kickstart the post-pandemic economy, so expect a big focus on childcare and plans for a green recovery. As part of the slogan the Liberals use called Build Back Better, it's a slogan the American President Joe Biden likes to use too. Expect more spending, big spending, to help people and businesses cope. And it's hoped, as I said, to kickstart a recovery. Canada's budget watchdog estimates that in the last fiscal year, Canada spent more than $271 billion on COVID measures. More than $89 billion went to the emergency wage subsidy to help businesses and employee wages, and more than $67 billion went to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB. People and individuals relied on that money, and that has sent the federal deficit soaring to an estimated $363.4 billion in 2020 and 2021. That's more than 9 times what it was in the previous fiscal year when the deficit was at about $39.4 billion. We used to think that was high. This is spending on a level that has not happened since the end of the Second World War. Pre-pandemic federal budgets came with some strict rules for reporters who used to be put in lockups for hours. They'd all have to gather at the same place and be given advance access to the budget documents so they could study them. And they were unable, of course, for those hours to make anything public until after 4 p.m. Eastern. That's when the finance minister delivers the budget to Parliament. Because of the pandemic, though, everything's changed with the lockup. It's virtual this year, and reporters are working from their homes or some of them in offices. And while the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, will actually be present in the House of Commons today, we will see her stand there and deliver the budget. There won't be very many MPs in the House. They, like the rest of us, have learned how to do things virtually, so there'll be a few people there, but don't expect a whole coterie of MPs. We have a team of reporters in the virtual lockup today, and they will be ready to break down and analyze today's numbers and promises when the finance minister formally tables the budget in the House of Commons. Before going into this virtual lockup this morning, our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, laid out what he will be watching for.
Well, I'm really looking at this budget as sort of the pandemic and beyond budget, and it's going to be very thick, 700 pages. And in my nearly 20 years covering budgets, that's going to be about one of the biggest, thickest budgets I've ever seen. Lots will be in it for pandemic and beyond. But as I mentioned, first order of the day for the federal government, just like any government in the country, let's get through this pandemic, through the public health challenge and the economic challenge. Beyond that, I expect we're going to see some talk about some big new programs for the beyond part. National Childcare program, or some sort of way to improve childcare availability and affordability right across the country, possibly using the Quebec model. Look for talk about the National Pharmacare program. That's something New Democrats have been pushing for. The Liberals are ready to start moving forward on that. We'll check out that. And then the Liberals say this pandemic is a time of opportunity, that's their phrase, to build back better. So lots of green initiatives, billions of dollars for a so-called green recovery. For consumers, look for some new taxes. Our friends at Reuters reporting new luxury taxes are on the way. If you buy an expensive car, an expensive boat, expect to pay more. Could also be some taxes on some digital platforms that we often use, a Netflix tax, something that's been talked about for a while. Could see a Netflix tax today and other taxes consumers will pay for some digital services. Businesses should also see possibly some new programs in the budget. The Toronto Star reporting that the Liberals today will announce a Canada Recovery Hiring Program, and that will be to be a subsidy for businesses as they bring on new employees, adding to employees. We're going to see that Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy continue. A lot of businesses using that, but now a new one, the Recovery Hiring Program, give Canadian business owners an incentive to bring more people back on the job. So there'll be lots in this budget. Of course, we'll have complete coverage for the budget 2021 pandemic and beyond. Back to you.
Forward to hearing more from you a little bit later, David. Chrystia Freeland is the first female federal finance minister in Canada, and it seems to me like that should have happened long before 2021, but never mind, at least it's happening now. And it is expected Freeland will look at some things through a different lens than her male predecessors did. Freeland took over this job from Bill Morneau back in August of 2020, and on the day that she took the job, she spoke about how her feminist agenda would inform her work in shaping Canada's economic recovery.
I'm glad that I'll have an opportunity to bring my experience as a woman, as a mother, to this really important challenge our country is facing.
Joining me now is economist and Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers, Armine Yalnizyan. Armine, you've been closely tracking the impacts of this pandemic on women now. And for months, you have been saying there is no recovery without a she-covery, and there's no she-covery without childcare. In a nutshell, for people who still don't get it, why is childcare so important?
Because women can't go to work when they've got a job. They can't accept work when they've got a job if there's no safe place for them to leave their kids. And since most provinces across the country have been unable to offer, the most populated provinces have been unable to offer secure schools, a lot of women have been doing the lion's share of homeschooling at home. And a lot of childcare centers, which are operated as businesses, not as social infrastructure, have had to reduce capacity. So there's been less opportunities for people to keep the spots that they've got or get a spot if they need one. So it's just like a road or a bridge. If you were to cut off 30% of the roads and bridges in your provinces, you think you can reopen and everything's fine? No, you're going to have to do something about that part of the infrastructure. Childcare is critical social infrastructure. And if we let it decline, women can't get back into the workforce.
What do you hope to hear from the government on this?
Well, we've been hearing since last fall that we have the first ever female finance minister that gets the role of women in the economy and understands how childcare is a critical piece of social infrastructure, not just a market service that you can buy, that we need to actually publicly fund and publicly manage what is essentially the education of our youngest learners. And I am hopeful that it will not be just a case of throwing more money at it, because it sounds like no matter what happens, they're going to throw more money at it. But women know it ain't how big it is. It's how you use it. And so we're hoping that it isn't just a large amount of money, but a large amount of money that actually builds on a system instead of expands a market that is failing far too many kids. There's childcare deserts all over the country, notwithstanding the fact that people are spending a fortune on childcare. And a lot of people turn to any kind of childcare just to warehouse their kids so they can go to work. Well, that's like leaving money on the table. We could be spending that same amount of money to ensure that every child is learning ready when they enter school and learning supported as they go through school. And when you maximize the learning potential of the next generation of kids, you're going to maximize their earning potential through life.
Armine, is Quebec getting it right? They have, the most heavily subsidized, most affordable childcare of any province in the country. Are they doing it the right way? Is that a model that should be replicated?
Well, we often talk about the Quebec model because the part of it they got right is they made care affordable and accessible everywhere. But what they knew immediately, having expanded access to care by simply putting money in people's pockets and not paying attention to the quality, as you pointed out, is that the kids who needed the most help didn't have that type of care available in their neighborhoods. So they were being taken care of by somebody down the street or around the corner, or in a church basement, but they weren't getting the quality of care that they needed. So Premier Legault in Quebec actually would be the first to tell you that quality is still something that Quebec, who is the undisputed leader in access to quantity, quality is the thing that Quebec needs to work on. And in fact, when he campaigned to become premier, one of the things he campaigned on is the thing that Ontario leads in, thanks to the previous premier, Kathleen Wynne, who introduced full-day junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten, which means that for 6 hours a day, your kid has got access to high-quality care that's publicly managed, regulated, is quality controlled. It's free to you for 6 hours a day. And so that's the model that we need to be working on, is educating down, actually treating early learning and childcare as an education system, as a way that we're helping our youngest become their best potential selves.
All right, we'll see what happens in this budget. Fingers crossed. Armin, thank you so much. Well, every budget we talk about shoes. It's a bit of a shtick for whoever is finance minister. They get a pair of new shoes or they recycle old ones. It's a symbol of the sort of budget it's going to be. Well, Chrystia Freeland unveiled her new budget shoes on Twitter.
I chose to buy my shoes from a great Canadian woman entrepreneur whose showroom for her company, Svel, is based in my own riding here in Toronto.
So there you go, a locally made company. They're black high heels, and Freeland says they show her support for small local businesses hit hard by the pandemic. She says she knows businesses are still struggling, and the government, she says, will be there to provide support. I'd say good luck to her wearing those heels, because I've all but given up on wearing them. But anyway, leading up to today, we've heard from industry stakeholders and experts, and now it's time for everyday Canadians to weigh in. One of our producers in Ottawa, Crystal Ogue, put the call out to see what people are looking for in today's budget. Here's some of what people said.
Well, I'd like to see just some continued support for small business. I think we all need to be weaned off some of these subsidies and things over time, obviously, because it's just not sustainable unless we can sustain ourselves. But certainly in these extenuating circumstances, it's nice to be able to rely on those a little bit longer. Also, I'd love to see some help for the businesses that are just falling through the cracks.
I'm a student, and so it's like, okay, what are we going to do for summer jobs? Last year we had the student support. This year I haven't heard anything. And the way things are in Toronto, the uncertainty around whether or not there is going to be any summer jobs available. So it's support for students. I haven't heard any talk around, is there going to be a special like last year to get us through the summer? Because for a lot of students, we rely on the summer jobs to earn enough money to pay our school fees and our living expenses for the rest of the year. And if you don't have that, then you're stuck.
I would like to see in the federal budget a guaranteed livable income or a basic income for all Canadians. Wanting to see like a living wage. I know that this is more of an Ontario issue than a federal issue. But it is upsetting to see that like even the most frontline workers who have been saving us through this pandemic, the retail workers and the grocery store workers, are still not even making enough to be able to live off of. That's very, very, very troubling for me. And then I'm also seeing like just the cost of housing become literally impossible in this country. And that's really, really troubling. And I want to know if the federal government will do something about that. Because at this point in time, you know, I'm approaching my middle age and I can't afford a house.
One of my biggest wishes, I guess you could say, for the federal budget would be to see more focus and more finances being put towards improving Indigenous communities. Why is there so much poverty in communities? Like, why is it a thing? Why don't they have great internet? You know, how are we supposed to be living in a digital world when a lot of us can't? We don't have the resources. So yeah, I would love to see that. Like, why are they having to boil water for their entire existence?
I would like to see in the federal budget some pushback on this quality, affordable daycare for all families. I think that that's a very strongly advocated issue right now that's happening. And I think that really needs to be addressed. There's a lot of stress in the world right now. And having extra stress, wondering, you know, what my bills are going to be like at the end of the day, what my account's going to look like. Can I afford a little extra food this month? Do I need to drive a little less? It's a big issue. It's a mortgage payment. Like in a sense, it's another mortgage payment. People are paying way too much money.
A lot of people concerned about money, obviously. As small businesses are huge employers in this country. They adapted and moved on and cut costs and racked up huge amounts of debt in order to try to survive. Many have not. I don't think we're going to Laura Jones right now. I don't believe we have a connection for her. I think we're moving on to Daryl Bricker, if I'm not mistaken. So we know that the Liberal government has mused about the idea of possibly triggering or having a federal election, although, of course, Justin Trudeau says he has said repeatedly he does not want a federal election, that there's too much going on at the moment. But he does have a minority government and would like nothing more than to have a majority again. So budget bills are confidence votes. It's conceivable that there could be a confidence vote that brings down this government. Let's go to Daryl Bricker, who's patiently waiting there with Ipsos polling. Daryl, you've done a lot of polling on whether people want a federal election at this point. I mean, it's hard for me to see. Let's just be frank. I don't want one right now because we got enough news going on. But that's just my personal take. But what about Canadians? Where are they at in terms of desire or lack of for a federal election?
Well, it's interesting, Donna, about 55% of Canadians would disagree with you. They want to have an election. But the interesting part of that is that they're almost all opposition voters. So people who want to have at the government as opposed to people who want to support the government. So given those kind of conditions, you would really wonder why it would be that the Prime Minister would trigger an election. And I'll just throw two other things at you. Over half of Canadians think that an election at this time would be unfair. And secondly, over half of Canadians think it would be unsafe.
To organize in a, we know that some provincial elections have gone well. We know the one in Newfoundland did not go so well. So it is a lot to consider, certainly. Daryl, you also asked Canadians what issues matter most to them right now. We just, prior to coming to you, heard some people bringing up some really specific issues about how they are hurting financially right now. What did you find out in your polling?
Well, there's really a couple of different things that we find out. First of all, overwhelmingly people care about the pandemic, but most of what they care about is fairly short term. So it's dealing with the crisis as we have it right now. A lot of what people were talking about in the package that you were discussing were things that were longer term problems and specific issues that are things that have been around outside of the pandemic. So their focus tends to be on things specifically related to the pandemic as opposed to all of this other stuff. And the other part that didn't really get discussed, which is still pretty important for Canadians, is whether or not our deficit is too high and whether our debt is becoming too high. And there still are an awful lot of Canadians that are concerned about that. So even though people want to have a lot of things paid for, somebody has to pay for it. And if it's coming out of our coming out of all of us by increasing our deficit and our debt beyond dealing with this pandemic, that's when it starts to get problematic.
Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to see this amount of spending, and yet I can't imagine there's much of an appetite for any increase in taxes either, which is the only real way to start adding some revenue.
Well, in fact, what we found in our survey was that people, the thing that was at the highest level of support was cutting taxes for lower income and medium income Canadians. There is support for increasing taxes for the richest, but people still want to see tax cuts for themselves. So it's interesting. They have a whole list of things that they want to spend on. They really don't want to pay anything for it. They're concerned about the deficit and they're concerned about the debt. All of that does not come together easily.
All right, Daryl Bricker, thank you so much for your insight. Will be interesting to see what we find out in the next, 40 minutes or so. Thanks so much. For more on what to watch for in this budget Donna. And what it means for Canadians, I want to bring in Sahir Khan in Ottawa. He is Executive Vice President of the University of Ottawa's Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Sahir, start with big picture. What are you expecting in tone and context from today?
Big measures already kind of telegraphed. It makes it a little unusual this year. You're almost kind of walking into a budget, kind of getting a preview of things that are kind of being tested politically. So I think it's less of a mystery of the measures. I think fiscally, we're kind of looking at three things. Do we end up in a position that leaves us kind of fiscally sustainable? Number two is like, what's the mix on dealing with the pandemic recovery and response? And then number three, what do we kind of have for the future? And how are we set up for an economy that's as big as it can be, as productive as it can be, so that we don't return to kind of the stagnation type growth, anemic growth that we had pre-pandemic. So I think there's a lot kind of riding on this budget to try to address kind of those three things, and a lot of different expectations, both from economists, but also I think politically as well, as Darrell Bricker kind of just explained.
Mm-hmm. The deficit of, as the Liberals state, under $400 billion is just a remarkable amount of money, highest it has been since the end of World War II. And yet, I think across the board, there's consensus that people and businesses needed to be helped through this pandemic. The money had to be spent. So is that fair to say?
It is, and I think the IMF has backed up kind of your point that this recession would have been far worse had the federal government not intervened. And keeping in mind that the provinces really didn't have the fiscal capacity to respond, so it would make sense that 80% of the support has really been coming from the federal government. So I think, yeah, without that kind of support, we would have seen a much worse kind of economic situation, and commensurately, we would have seen a much worse fiscal situation had the federal government not intervened the way it had.
What is your biggest concern about that amount of spending, though? I mean, I guess it's, we hear telegraphed that there will be efforts, initiatives to try to kickstart the economy. What's your greatest concern about that?
I think we worry a lot about the headline numbers and size of deficits. I think for fiscal people like me, we try to pay as much attention as to the composition of that spending and the quality. Are we getting results for this? Because if we're going to hand over a big mountain of debt to the next generation, are they going to inherit a productive economy, an innovative economy, a big workforce that's well-trained, young people that can find good-paying jobs and pay taxes? If that's the legacy of this budget, then that will be something that I think that government Canadians can really buy into, Canadians in particular. So, but if it's just transfers, and if we just see spending increasing without it kind of being investments, and I use the word investment specifically to mean a return to the economy of those expenditures. If we see expenditures and very little to show for it, then we're telling the next generation that they're going to compete globally with one hand tied behind their back. And I think that's really the challenge for this government and this upcoming budget.
Just one final quick question, Zahir. The NDP called for a wealth tax. We know there are lots of people. There's effectively two pandemics. There are a lot of people like me who have been working through it all, have had the luxury at times of working from home. A whole bunch of other people in that same situation, then a whole range of other people, of course, who are not in that situation, who have to go to work, whether there are restrictions in place or not, who live in congregate settings, who take, public transportation, who just are putting themselves at much greater risk in order to earn a living. Is the idea of doing something to tax the wealthy, or at least have them pay a bit more at this point, an idea that has legs, do you think?
Well, I think that there's kind of a technical answer to that and a political answer. I think the technical answer is that when you try to put income taxes on the highest earners in Canada, they have a way they tend to have the tools to get around some of those. They have a way to shift money around and move them, even out of the country if necessary. The other issue is a political one. Do you really want to do a lot on the tax front ahead of a potential election that we're expecting this fall? And my suspicion is probably not the right time for politically for taxes. What it does suggest, though, is that maybe we have to look at our tax base and ask ourselves whether we have the right mix, whether the right instruments, and the right levels of taxation. We've had a rather steady decline in revenue relative to the size of the economy, growth of the economy for a long time now. The Harper government reduced the GST by 2 points. That's worth about $16 billion a year in revenue. And so it's really a question of how much does this current government want to reoccupy that space that the federal government used to have. And that's, I think, a more fundamental question that might be worth discussing in the context of the next election.
All right, Zahir Khan in Ottawa, thank you so much for your insight today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Don.
We want to take you to Parliament Hill now. The Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is expected to meet very shortly with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. before presenting our budget in the House of Commons. They usually walk over there together. It used to be down the steps and into the House of Commons. Of course, that's all changed because of renovations and because of the pandemic going on. So at the moment we see Chrystia Freeland and the Prime Minister there, we'll probably they usually carry the budget document, which David Akin, I think, said is 700 pages. So it's going to be a bit of weight for them to carry, but they usually hold it up for a photo op and we can get a sense of what their sort of slogan is and what their tone is for the day. Now, small businesses, of course, are huge employers in this country. And as I said, they have adapted. They've moved online in many cases. They have cut costs. And they've racked up huge amounts of debt in order to try to survive. Many have not survived. I want to bring in Laura Jones. She's Executive Vice President of the Canadian Federation for Independent Business. Laura, I've read that 70% of small businesses took on new debt in the pandemic, amounting to about $135 billion.
Does something more?
What are they looking for in this budget?
Well, there are a couple of big things that small businesses are looking for. The first one, by far and away, is do no harm in terms of additional taxes or costs. The cupboards are bare. As you said, businesses have taken on, the majority have taken on debt, and that average is around $170,000 per business. So, and there's a huge wide range around that, depending on what sector you're in or whether you're a downtown business versus someone that might be in a smaller community. But that's a lot of debt. So no new taxes, no new costs. That by far and away, 9 out of 10 businesses across Canada are saying, please, we can't, the cupboards are bare. There's no room for that right now. That's a big thing. The second big thing is making sure there's enough support to see businesses through the pandemic. And, increasingly, unfortunately, this looks like we're going to need that, well past June. And we're getting indications that is going to be in the budget. So that will be some good news for businesses. But as long as there are restrictions in place, there should be supports to go along with those restrictions, is the view of the majority of Canadian small businesses.
I think the government has telegraphed that they are going to continue the supports for a couple of months at least. The impacts of the pandemic, as we've been saying, are so uneven across the country, given how infection rates and restrictions vary so much from province to province. How do you think that complicates the federal response?
Well, it's interesting when you look at businesses in the West that have been more open, and I would say that British Columbia and some of the other Western provinces have done a better job of kind of really targeting the risks in order to keep as much open as possible while managing the health part of the pandemic. So you can still go to a hairdresser in Vancouver. Of course, that's not the case in Toronto or in Peel right now. And so what you're seeing in our numbers is while the vast majority of businesses still need support, that's a little bit less in Western Canada, and you're seeing a little bit more deficit hawkishness in the West. So again, all businesses understand we're in extraordinary circumstances. We need to run big deficits right now. But in the West, you see more of a sort of let's make sure there's a plan to get out of this medium term, a bit of a stronger appetite for that than in some of in Ontario, for example. And I think that just reflects the tale of two pandemics. Businesses across the country are struggling, but if the stress in the West and British Columbia is high, it's off the charts right now in provinces like Ontario that have been more restricted. In fact, we have the fewest businesses in Canada open in Ontario, and the fewest businesses reporting that they're back to normal revenues, only 1 in 4 in Ontario. So things are pretty dire compared to 1 in 3, for example, in British Columbia, which is still bad, but it's a little bit better.
Yeah, it is absolutely dire in Ontario in particular, and extremely difficult for individuals and businesses and essential workers and everybody, just wishing the vaccines would arrive soon, sooner than they have. Thank you so much, Laura Jones, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Federation for Independent Business. We appreciate your time. We have a team of journalists and experts standing by. They've been studying the budget document all morning and will be ready to reveal what's in it as soon as the Finance Minister appears and that embargo is lifted. We are going to continue our coverage here on Global News Online, and in just a moment, we'll also welcome viewers watching on the Global TV network.
This is a Global News special presentation.
Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the 2021 federal budget. In just a few minutes, we will find out what is in it. We are expecting an accounting, of course, of the unprecedented spending that has happened during the course of this pandemic, and also a plan for how the country will recover from it economically. So lots on the table today. This is Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's first federal budget. The first in the country, in fact, for more than 2 years. And there's a whole lot riding on this. We're just waiting for, there is the Prime Minister now, along with the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland. They're holding the budget documents, which are, David Aiken tells us, are about 700 pages. So a lot of fine print in there. There they are. I can't quite make out what it says on the cover. Eye's not quite that good, but sometimes you see these in these photo ops, they give the thumbs up, they look super enthusiastic, like everything's going to be okay, folks. That's not the tone of this, because everybody knows that Canada is actually in terms of case counts and COVID infection rates, the worst we've been since this pandemic began. No one expected after more than a year of the pandemic the situation in Canada would be worse than it ever has been. In several provinces, including Ontario, the third wave is now surging. Vaccines are rolling out, but the variants, of course, are spreading faster. And with yet another round of restrictions in place, Canadians are frustrated, they're fed up, many are struggling. We are expecting more money in today's budget to help get businesses and individuals through the immediate crisis. The government will also lay out how it plans to kickstart the post-pandemic economy. So expect to see a big focus on childcare and plans for a green recovery as part of the Trudeau government's strategy to deliver on their slogan that they like to use, Build Back Better. Well, as Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland plays a big role in this government, and this is a big moment for her. We just saw her walk into the House of Commons there. As soon as we see her stand up and begin to deliver the budget, that's when we can reveal what is in fact in it. Our reporters have been in a virtual lockup through the course of the day, so they've been reading through those 700 pages and will be able to distill at least the big picture elements of what is in the budget. As we wait for that, it should be happening momentarily. Let's go to our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson. Mercedes, I know you can't talk about what's actually in the budget yet. People will just have to hang on for a few more minutes. But the Liberals have really telegraphed quite clearly what they hope this budget will do, and even some figures of how much money they expect to spend. What are the dominant themes at play?
Well, I can talk about the themes before the budget, and I'll be very careful here, Donna, because as you know, we can't say anything that is in the budget, and I can't even show you the budget, which I have actually next to me down there at the side of the desk, because we are waiting for it to be released under embargo. But obviously, the biggest thing the government has been thinking about going into this is COVID-19. And this has been the third wave that has devastated much of the country, certainly for those of us here in Ontario, a very, very serious situation. And the government has really had to think about that in terms of how are they going to deal with this budget and what they were going to put into the budget. And they've made no secret of that fact. They've made no secret of the fact that this would likely be a big spending budget. They've made no secret of the fact that they were looking at this as an opportunity to try to roll out childcare, and we'll find out if that's happening in the budget. But certainly the Deputy Prime Minister / Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has been very clear about dropping big hints that that is expected to be a big theme in this. And of course, getting Canadians back to work is something else that the government has talked about a lot, as well as supporting individual Canadians, because as we're in this third wave, and you know, a lot of folks are finding themselves out of work or worried that they will be out of work.
Alan says it's very
Mercedes votes on budgets are always confidence votes, and this, of course, is a Liberal minority government. So in theory, the opposition could trigger an election over this if they wanted to. But we already know that is unlikely, right?
It is. And, you know, Donna, at any other time in a minority government, especially when you were talking about some of the things this government was talking about going in, if they show up in this budget, which were controversial, those could be things that a government either stays or falls on. And a lot of horse trading would have been required with the opposition. They did not have to do the same kind of horse trading heading into this budget as they normally would in a minority, because the NDP has already said that they likely wouldn't bring the government down, that they don't want an election. The Conservatives don't want an election. Although they might more safely be able to vote against this budget than, for example, the NDP, because they're not at risk of bringing the government down with just the Conservatives alone. We'll see how they react to what is actually in the document when they have a chance to look at it. But when you look at the country right now, and when you look at what happened in the recent election in Newfoundland and Labrador, there's just really a feeling among MPs from all ridings that there's no appetite for an election. So while this will still serve as very much being a political election document that the Liberals will go into what could be a summer or fall election with, the chance of the government coming down on this is relatively low. But remember, it is always still there. This is a minority and anything could happen.
Hard to imagine an election, especially in Ontario right now, right, with everything that is going on there. Mercedes, as we wait for the finance minister, hopefully she'll rise and begin speaking shortly and we can reveal the details of the budget. But she's, oh, I believe she is. There she is. Let's listen for a moment.
The details regarding these measures are included in these documents and pursuant to Standing Order 83.2. I ask that the study of these motions be added to the orders of the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, there are the budget documents handed over. 700 pages in French and English, of course. We're going to go directly to our reporters who know what is in those documents because they've spent the last several hours digging into all the details in a lockup. David Aiken now joins me from the West Block. David, I believe you're there. Can you give me the big takeaways? What are the headlines in this budget?
Here on Parliament Hill, the big headline is this: spending. So Chrystia Freeland is proposing to spend $50 billion in spending programs this year, and that is on top of the billions of dollars of emergency pandemic spending that will continue to exist. That means significant deficits for the next several years with no target date for a balanced budget. The federal deficit for the fiscal year that just ended on March 31st is expected to be about $354 billion, and that will, as expected, push the national debt past the $1 trillion mark for the first time. Ottawa expects the deficit this year to top $154 billion, but projects a drop in 2022-2023 to under $60 billion and to be around $30 billion by the spring of 2026. The centerpiece of the first budget ever presented by a woman is a commitment to build a new national childcare program.
This budget makes a historic investment in early learning and childcare. After 50 years of talking about it and fighting for it, we're finally going to get it done.
But it will not be cheap or quick. It will cost $30 billion over the next 5 years and will require significant negotiations with the provinces. That's the biggest single spending commitment, but there are plenty more. For example, $3 billion to improve long-term care homes, $17.6 billion for so-called green recovery initiatives, and a new investment of $18 billion to improve health and economic development in Indigenous communities. On top of that, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy will be extended until the end of September. Something new for business, a Canada Recovery Hiring Program that will start in June. This will be a subsidy paid to employers who add people to their payroll. The budget also establishes a minimum wage for federally regulated companies of $15 an hour. All of this will push the debt-to-GDP ratio from pre-pandemic levels of about 30% to more than 50% this year, and it will stay around 50% for at least the next 5 years.
The question is, are we fiscally sustainable? We are, but there's a big but. That also makes assumptions that things like interest rates will not change significantly in the medium term.
And so, Donna, now we turn to the politics of this budget. And this budget document, it's 724 pages. There is a ton of stuff in here for all the political parties to pick over. And as you mentioned, it's a minority government that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau leads, which means he's going to need at least one other party to sign on to his plan and avoid triggering a general election this spring. Donna?
I know you've had the advantage of reading through at least some of the 700 pages, way more reading than I've been able to do. So can you break down for our audience a little bit of the childcare plan, which, as you said, is the centerpiece of this? $30 billion, I believe you said. Is there detail about how it will be spent and how they will try to implement their long-promised, talked-about plan for some kind of universal childcare?
Well, the first thing to know is next month, there's not going to be a new childcare space in your neighborhood. I think that's clear. It is a national program, a national sustainable system. That means finding and building more childcare spaces, training more childcare personnel. And here's the big thing that's going to take time is talking to the provinces about how to do this. Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, wants to model this on what they're doing in Quebec, where they have $10 a day childcare. And she is vowing in this budget that somewhere over the next 5 years, maybe 3 years, there will be $10 a day childcare for everyone right across the country. That is her goal as she starts in on this with this big bucket of cash, $30 billion. But that cash is going to have to go to provinces who will administer these programs. And Donna, you've seen this movie a million times.
Oh my goodness,
when a federal says to the provinces, you want to do this? They'll say, well, just give us the cash and we'll figure it out. So that's the details is, what do you want to do with all this money, provinces?
Yeah, I mean, and the reason is because daycare is a provincial responsibility and childcare is a provincial responsibility. So it sort of has to be this way in the way we're organized in Canada. Am I right about that?
You are. And here's the other thing. When Chrystia Freeland shows up to say, hey, will you guys run my childcare program? Here's what the provinces are going to say. This is about the stuff not in the budget. Always important to know what's not in a budget. What's not in this budget? Any increase in the amount of money that Ottawa transfers to the provinces for health care. And again, you've heard this before, the premiers have been crying for the last year for a huge increase in what's called the Canada Health Transfer. That's the money transferred every year to the provinces for health care. There is no increase. The Trudeau government continues what the Harper government started, which is a minimum 3% a year increase. The provinces wanted something 6, 7, 8% more. They're not getting it. So that's not in the budget. Other things not in the budget. Really nothing moving on national pharmacare. There's just keep talking to the provinces again on that. There's no move here to try to impose a wealth tax. That's something the NDP wanted. There's no move here. There's not even mention of a universal basic income. And that, too, is something New Democrats wanted. There is some luxury taxes. If you were planning to buy an expensive car or a private aircraft, you're going to pay extra tax. But that's it in terms of targeting more taxes at the rich. Again, we need one party to sign on here. And if it's New Democrats, I can see it right now. We'll hear from Jagmeet Singh, I know, later. And he's going to be saying, where's the, I want to eliminate billionaires. That's what the NDP voted at their convention. They want more taxes on the wealthy, and they're not in this budget.
Well, I think there were more billionaires created, or more people became billionaires in 2020 than ever in history. So, you know, there are 2 pandemics going on here, and there are plenty of people who have gotten very rich and done very well through the course of this pandemic, and then a whole bunch of hundreds of thousands of people who are not in that position and who desperately need government help and better programs. In particular, getting back to the childcare thing, you know, this is so kind of central to not only to this government, but to Chrystia Freeland as a person. Right? She has said that as a woman and a mother, her experience will inform the kind of finance minister that she is. Did you see her sort of fingerprints on this document?
Yes, very much. And she of course, I mean, she broadcast this in the fall economic statement, saying almost what you just did, Donna, in the House of Commons, saying, as a mother, as a woman who is the first female finance minister in our history, this is important to her. She talked about it as well with Ken Dryden, the last architect of a childcare program nationally that went nowhere. She talked with Dryden at the Liberal Convention. So she is very much invested in this. And by the way, she pointed out, certainly, yes, she's a mom and all that. But one of the important things here is, childcare is no longer, it hasn't been probably for 10 or 20 years, a, quote, woman's issue. It is a core economic issue, and that is how the finance minister is portraying this. They're saying, listen, we're in a time when we have two-parent families, and childcare is crucial if we're going to increase labor participation rates, which means then we increase general prosperity, increase our tax base. It is fundamental being able to say to parents, you can still go to work and still raise kids. That's why we need a childcare program. And I don't think there's a lot of argument with the rationale there from probably all the provinces. Again, the issue will be provinces are really going to be annoyed that there's no Canada Health transfer, and they're going to say, listen, you got a deal here. You want this childcare? We do too, but you got to give more for health care. So definitely this is Freeland's, this is the marquee proposal in this 724-page budget, but it is going to take a lot of lifting, and it's nothing that's going to happen anytime soon.
David, what about the green recovery? And we were telegraphed at least that was going to be a critical piece in this budget too. Not so much for right now, but to kickstart the economy. And when we rebuild, it will be a green rebuild.
Right.
What is in here related to that? Was there any mention in specifically of small modular reactors, of endorsing nuclear reactors?
Yeah, it's stuff like that. The budget is peppered with stuff like that. Not necessarily big items. I'm not going to say here and there's going, well, there's $40 billion for program X. But when you add it all up, there are dozens and dozens of smaller programs, particularly for farmers. There's a lot of money for farmers and agricultural producers. We know they're big greenhouse gas producers to use cleaner energy, to move to different kinds of fertilizer, move to different kinds of farming. So that's just one particular sector. There's a lot of money when we talk about green recovery to what they call the blue ocean strategy, taking a look at, we're surrounded by these oceans. How do we harness the resources of the ocean, energy resources, food resources, you name it. There's programs for that. Programs to get Canadians to drive electric vehicles. And here's one thing. Remember last week we saw Erin O'Toole and the Conservative Party table a climate change plan. And I know there's been some arguing, but by and large, the experts say it is a credible plan that would help us achieve our targets. Well, the targets that existed last week, because get this, the Trudeau government today has anteed up even further. They have more aggressive targets. They now want to exceed the Paris targets, even though, the cynics will say the Trudeau government has not done a very good job achieving the old targets. So there you go. They've got some new targets, and as I say, a whole raft of programs that touch on all sorts of sectors to try to get people to adopt green tech, change their ways, get consumers to think differently about being green, change your homes. There are going to be programs galore over the next couple of years. And certainly, if this is an election budget, you could see Liberal candidates going around the country and saying, we'll change the windows in your home. We'll get you in an electric car. Farmers, we're going to change the way and give you some money for to improve the way you fertilize your fields. The budget's laced with that sort of stuff.
Okay, David Akin, thank you so much for your... Well, we've talked a lot about childcare. As we said, the finance minister signaled it would be a key element of this budget. Access to quality care, of course, is key to getting the post-pandemic economy back on track and getting women back into the workforce. Abigail Beeman is in Ottawa with more of the details on what the government is planning on childcare.
She's 8 months old, and Amaya's parents have been searching for childcare her whole life. Her mom starts a new job next month.
Seems like the daycares are open and shut thanks to the pandemic. We don't have any clarity on who's accepting children, and she's on multiple wait lists right now, and nothing has really come through.
Tough to find and to pay for.
Definitely we'll have to compromise on many more things if we want the best care.
Toronto has the highest childcare fees in the country, more than $70 a day for a toddler. Edmonton is around the middle, around $44 a day. Quebec offers the cheapest, less than $10.
Sometimes it even makes me want to think about not going back to work and just staying back and caring for her. But I think about the impact it has on what she'd think about me if her mother, being such a qualified person, just gave up and sat back at home and did not progress in her career.
Chrystia Freeland was 2 years old when childcare was first declared imperative to women's equality. 50 years later, during a pandemic that's exacerbated the problem, the country's first woman finance minister promises to do what no federal government could in half a century.
Our goal is that within 5 years, families everywhere in Canada should have access to high-quality daycare for an average of $10 a day.
A 50% cut in fees by next year, and childcare for $10 a day by 2026. To make it happen, the Liberals plan to spend $30 billion over the next 5 years, eventually a permanent annual commitment of $8.3 billion, $9.2 if you count previous promises.
If this is something that survives the next election, it could be truly transformative for the sector. Unfortunately for advocates, essentially all of the previous childcare plans have been dashed on the rocks of an election.
Childcare is critical social infrastructure, and if we let it decline, women can't get back into the workforce.
The Liberals are proposing to split childcare fees with the provinces 50-50 in order to make this happen. But that will involve more negotiations, and for cash-strapped provinces which don't already heavily invest in childcare, there's no guarantee they'll sign on. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Well, to take a deeper look at what else is in the budget and what it means for the average Canadian, I want to go to Sahir Khan. He is the Executive Vice President at the University of Ottawa's Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Sahir, this is a big budget, a lot of spending. What strikes you about it? What's the biggest takeaway from an economic perspective?
Well, I think that there's a kind of a combined effect here. So there's part of this budget's really about the recovery and the response, and there's a great deal of funds kind of just applied to that. That kind of transformative element of that pivot to the new economy is kind of, it's very clear, and it's on a couple of dimensions. One is the labor force itself. There's a big allocation towards the labor force, and I would throw childcare into that. That's labor force participation. The other aspect is the innovative economy. It's a very significant push into investing in early stage, whether it's biotech, high tech, genomics. These are all aspects of this budget that are really trying to orient towards a future economy. And then infrastructure. I think both in a First Nations context and a national context, there's a doubling down. Make the public transit has now been kind of enshrined as a major initiative going forward. So all of that kind of aspects of this budget targeting a bigger economy, a more productive economy are absolutely clear, but they are kind of tempered by the fact that we're not over this pandemic. And there really isn't going to be an economic recovery without a public health recovery. And the balance of the budget, I think, are a hodgepodge of kind of interesting items that are almost politically oriented, that start to feel like a political platform leading to a future election. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of my takeaways, kind of at a high level.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people anticipate this was going to be, as sort of a pre-election platform. A big question, Sahir, is how can the country afford what the finance minister has laid out in this budget? Based on what you have seen, what are they banking on to make this work?
Well, I think they're banking on interest rates staying relatively low. I think that's the first assumption. We didn't see any scenarios of what things might look like if rates would change. We did see a change in strategy in trying to lock in longer term debt, which seems to be a bit of a shift for the government and probably a good one to kind of insulate the portfolio of debt against shocks to interest rates. Broadly speaking, though, this is a sustainable package. So I think the government's going to kind of find out that we can deal with this in the long term, as long as the surge in expenditure doesn't become permanent. Some of it will be, but by a lot of these are fairly temporary, targeted measures that should start to disappear as we kind of get over the pandemic and get over this recovery phase. So on the whole, it's sustainable. I think where we really need to focus on as taxpayers and anyone in the media is the quality of spending. What results are we getting for this money? Because if we don't get outcomes out of this, the result for the next generation is a lot of debt without a more productive economy, without a better labor force, with poorer infrastructure. And I think we have to keep our eye on the results that we're getting, and that's kind of the big test for this government, going from things that are kind of a good idea in theory to things that actually will translate into results for Canadians.
Yeah, and so much has been, in the past year, things that none of us have been able to anticipate, right? I mean, the pandemic and the way it's played out has just been so devastating. Honestly, I don't envy anyone who is in a position of having to run the finances of a government right now. The government is looking, I understand, at employment rate, total hours worked, and unemployment rate across the country to set some fiscal guardrails. We know from the first and second wave, those numbers appeared to bounce back a little bit. But now that we're in the middle of this very bad third wave, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I almost think that this third wave caught the government a little bit off guard. If there was a strategy coming out of the fiscal update, it was kind of banking on a bit of a recovery at this rate. And keep in mind that the income supports, the supports to individuals and businesses largely been coming from the federal government, some 80%. So there's a dependency on the federal government to kind of insulate this economy from an even worse shock. And I think that's taken up some of the room that might have been applied to more transformative initiatives. But I think it's important to keep an eye on that, because if we don't deal with this pandemic effectively and get out of it with some momentum, we're really not going to get to a more resilient, more productive economy going forward. And at the other end of this, we could end up with a worse fiscal situation, a worse economic situation.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about what some of the people we talked to said they wanted a priority, made a priority, and that is affordable housing. Is there any sign of anything that will help people with that? House prices have in many cities in this country have gone up in 2020.
Well, I think Donna, you mentioned the fiscal guardrail. I think there were some natural limitations that were kind of imposed on this budget. So the government probably couldn't have more than one or two signature measures, as we've kind of now seen in this budget. Housing is a problem, but it's very difficult to rely solely on kind of government intervention in the short run to change that. We need a bigger supply of housing stock to actually have the market respond to this, and that isn't simple. Because if we want more densification in urban areas, you're going to have to match those high rises for families with schools and parks and public transit. A lot of planning has to go into that. And we noted that the government announced a new national infrastructure assessment. And my hope is that we'll start to think about those other attributes that families need to have livable communities while we're densifying and developing affordable housing stock for Canadians.
All right, Zahir Khan in Ottawa, thank you so much. Let's go back to our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa. Mercedes, and now that we can talk about the details, let's start with childcare. How big a promise is this, and is it something that is deliverable? I mean, we've heard the promise. I think I first started reporting on accessible, affordable childcare in the 1980s.
Yeah, it's something a lot of women have been looking for a long time, Donna. I mean, it's a lot more money than people had necessarily thought they might spend. That bodes well for the program actually taking place. But the tricky part is going to be actually getting this accepted by the provinces, because as you were talking about earlier, it's not just a federal program, it's a provincial program. This is still probably several years away, a lot of political negotiations, and there's not a lot of love lost between some provinces and the federal government right now. But $30 billion is a very substantial investment in terms of the ability to stand up a serious program that's not piecemeal.
Mercedes, what else are you seeing in this? Where are the fragile points for the government in this budget?
I think the fragile points are a lot of the things that aren't in there the NDP wanted. You might see some horse trading on that now, Donna, as the NDP looks for that. I suspect the Liberals will be prepared and have a little bit of breathing room there. But things like pharmacare not in there, universal basic income, a wealth tax, none of those things were in there. That's the big vulnerabilities. But their biggest padding on this is the pandemic, which was also the biggest turnkey for them on this budget, because it really had to become about now and COVID-19, not so much the transformative budget they might have wanted to present.
A lot of people have talked about the amount of the debt and deficit, that it is, well, it's never been this high, or not since the Second World War. How concerning is that, or how confident is this government that there's so much pent-up demand among people who haven't suffered financially that things really could recover much more quickly than we expect?
And that's what's happened so far, that we've seen a quick elastic bounce back. We'll see if that continues. There's a lot of optimistic numbers in here, Donna, that will require people to either not uptake the program or for the economy to do better than it may. So there is certainly a risk factor in here now, but they're banking on Canadians having an appetite to spend.
All right, Mercedes Stevenson, our Ottawa Bureau Chief, thank you so much. Our special coverage continues with Robin Gill, and later today on Global National, we will have an interview with the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland. For now, thanks for watching. I'm Donna Friesen.
This is a Global News special presentation.
Hello and welcome to our special coverage of Budget 2021. Today, Chrystia Freeland tabled her first budget as Finance Minister and her government's first budget in nearly 2 years. It's significant on so many fronts. First, a blueprint for how and if Canada can recover from the setbacks of the pandemic. And it's a test of whether Justin Trudeau's minority government can survive. Let's take a listen to Chrystia Freeland and her vision for Canada's finances.
Of global investment and growth. The resource and manufacturing sectors that are Canada's traditional economic pillars, energy, mining, agriculture, forestry, steel, aluminum, autos, aerospace, will be the foundation of our new, resilient, and sustainable economy. Canada will become more productive and competitive by supplying the green exports the world wants and needs. That is why we propose a historic investment of a further $5 billion over 7 years, starting in 2021, 2022 in the Net Zero Accelerator. With this added support, on top of the $3 billion we committed in December, the Net Zero Accelerator will help even more companies invest to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions while continuing to grow their businesses.
We will propel the green transition through new tax measures, including for zero emissions technology, carbon capture and storage, and green hydrogen. We are at a pivotal moment in the green transformation. We can lead, or we can be left behind. Our government knows that the only choice for Canada is to be in the vanguard. Our growing population is one of our great economic strengths, and a growing country needs to build. We need to build housing. We need to build public transit. We need to build broadband. We need to build infrastructure. And we will. We will invest $2.5 billion and reallocate $1.3 billion in existing funding to help build, repair, and support 35,000 housing units. And we will support the conversion to housing of the empty office space that has appeared in our downtowns by reallocating $300 million from the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. Houses should not be passive investment vehicles for offshore money. They should be homes for Canadian families. So, on January 1st, 2022, our government will introduce Canada's first national tax on vacant property owned by non-resident, non-Canadians.
Strong, sustained growth also depends on modern transit. That's why, in February,
I'm sure the opposition has a lot to say about this budget, and we're hearing now from Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole. He's about to speak and react to this budget.
We are now in Justin Trudeau's third wave of this pandemic. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and modeling suggests that things will only get worse without the desperately needed supply of vaccines. But this budget does nothing to answer the calls from Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta, and other provinces asking for more vaccines. Justin Trudeau has moved too slow for this virus. It's racing ahead of us now. And now he is slow in providing real help for Canadians in this budget. This disappointment needs to stop. Nous sommes dans la troisième vague de Justin Trudeau. Les libéraux ont agi trop lentement contre ce virus. Maintenant, dans son budget, Justin Trudeau est lent à aider les Canadiens. Canadians are asking for an economic recovery plan that improves their personal financial security by creating jobs, increasing wages, and lowering taxes. Unfortunately, this budget does next to nothing to secure the Canadian economy. Unemployed Canadians hoping to find work, workers who've had their wages cut due to lockdowns, and families hoping for lower taxes to pay down their mortgage or to save for their children's education, they're all going to feel let down by this Liberal budget. They continue to be left behind by Mr. Trudeau. This budget will not secure the economy for unemployed Canadians and workers who've lost their jobs due to lockdowns. Families hoping to lower taxes and get ahead are not being listened to. They're all going to be asking for more. Ce budget ne protège pas l'économie. Il laisse tomber les Canadiens sans travail et les travailleurs, dont le salaire a diminué à cause des confinements. Il abandonne les familles qui attendent une diminution d'impôts pour rembourser leur hypothèque ou épargner pour les études de leurs enfants. Une fois de plus, les Canadiens vont se sentir abandonnés par les libéraux. The Prime Minister also wants to test an out-of-control debt plan without any real stimulus, one that abandons the natural resource sector entirely and provides no real fiscal anchor. This Ottawa knows best approach will continue to lead in ballooning housing costs, higher taxes, growing risk of inflation, and will leave millions of Canadians behind. This budget has no real plan for small business or for students, only offering temporary band-aids to these thousands of Canadians. Canada's Conservatives have put forward the Canada Recovery Plan to secure your personal finances by recovering the million jobs lost during the pandemic and even more, by supporting the sectors hit hardest by the pandemic, and by helping those who have suffered the most throughout it, particularly women and young Canadians. Les conservateurs ont présenté le plan de rétablissement du Canada. Ce plan va protéger vos finances personnelles en récupérant le million d'emplois perdus pendant cette pandémie. Nous allons soutenir les secteurs les plus touchés, en plus d'aider ceux qui souffrent le plus, comme les femmes et les jeunes. The budget tabled by the Liberals today is an incredible letdown for Canadians. Canada's Conservatives were very clear that we wanted to see the plan to return to normal in this budget that would secure jobs for all Canadians in all parts of the country. Mr. Trudeau failed to put forward a plan to help Canadians, and he's leaving them behind. That is why the Conservatives will be proposing amendments and our own policies, because we feel this falls so incredibly short. It's time for Canada to lead again after lagging time after time over the last year in this pandemic. Unlike the Trudeau Liberals, Canada's Conservatives will ensure that no Canadian is left behind and that we lead the world in an economic recovery post-COVID. Conservatives got us out of the last global recession. Canadians are worried, and they need to know that we will get them out of this one too. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
And we'll now take questions, starting with questions on the phone. A quick reminder to reporters, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions, commençant par les questions au téléphone. Un petit rappel, une question suivie par journaliste. Today, Mr. O'Toole will take 6 questions, 3 on the phone, 3 in the room. Aujourd'hui, M. O'Toole prendra 6 questions, 3 dans la salle, 3 au téléphone. Nous allons commencer par le téléphone. We'll now start by the phone. Operator, do we have a first question?
Thank you. Merci. As a reminder, please press star 1 for any question. N'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. And our first question, la prochaine question est de Geneviève Normand de Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour. Merci de prendre ma question. Première des choses, M. O'Toole, si vous êtes élu, est-ce que vous allez conserver le programme de garderie mis en place par Ottawa aujourd'hui?
Concerne le programme, est-ce qu'il y a des conditions pour le Québec ou les autres provinces? Combien de places pour les familles canadiennes? Les libéraux ont déjà promis un programme comme ça 3 fois. Selon moi, c'est important d'appuyer les parents.
We will continue to get reaction from the opposition, but let's go to our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, to guide us through the key highlights of this budget. David, let's talk about the numbers first. A deficit of $354 billion this year, $1 trillion in debt, no target date for a balanced budget. How are Canadians going to swallow this?
Probably they won't mind. I mean, this is all the polling we've done is deficits just by themselves are not necessarily something that Canadians are getting upset about right now. It's, are you going at a deficit for some good reasons? And you're right, it's $354 billion for the fiscal year just ended. That ended on March 31st. So that's last year. That was all the COVID spending. $354 billion is a crazy amount of money. To put that in perspective, in any normal budget year, the entire budget would be about $350 billion. So that's just how big the deficit was last year. Now, for the year we're in a new fiscal year, and the budget this year is going to drop to $154 billion. That is still huge. And then it's going to drop even further, about $60, $70 billion, down to about a deficit of, say, $30 billion by 2026. We went into this pandemic, the budget year prior, at about a $30 billion deficit. Those are big numbers. Can we afford it? Yes. Economists say it is sustainable in this low interest rate environment. If interest rates start to rise, then we could be into some issues. And the key metric I think that Canadians will look for when it comes to all these big, huge deficits is our debt to GDP ratio, our debt relative to the size of our national economy. Before the pandemic, it was sitting at about 30%. 30% of our economy equaled about 30% of our debt. All of our debt. Now, this year it's going to spike up to 50%, and it's going to stay at 50% even though the deficits start to get smaller because we've got this now trillion-dollar debt. But still we're spending not so much on servicing that debt. All that spending, what's it good for? Robin, here's the budget, okay? 724 pages. I've been doing this for covering federal budgets for more than 20 years now. I can't remember one this thick, and this is chock full of spending programs. $50 billion, 50 spending, $50 billion in spending programs in this fiscal year on top of all that emergency spending that is sticking around. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy, they'll still be here. They're going to extend them till September, and they cost billions of dollars. But now what's in here, this $50 billion worth of spending, it's on pandemic and beyond, on the recovery, and of course the big highlight for Chrystia Freeland, the first female ever to present a budget in our history, is a national childcare program. She's going to put down $30 billion over the next 5 years, but she needs the provinces to help her out with this. It's going to take a little while to get this thing, but before she leaves, she wants $10 a day childcare for everyone in the country, just like they have in Quebec.
But it's not happening right away, though, is it? And by the way, I'm sure you read every single one of those 700 pages in the budget.
Absolutely, Robin, yes.
Yeah, it's a matter of negotiating, though, with the provinces. It's not like it's so easy to set up.
It isn't. And I told you, 720 pages, all these spending programs. Let me tell you what's not in the budget. there is no commitment by the Trudeau Liberals to increase the annual health care transfer to the provinces. It's called the Canada Health Transfer. And the premiers have been crying for an increase for the last year. They've met with Trudeau, they've had special meetings. Every time the premiers talk to Trudeau, they say, you got to give us more money for healthcare. This is not pandemic-related healthcare spending. This is ongoing healthcare, the cost of healthcare. And there is no commitment in this document, this budget, to increase the amount of the Canada Health Transfer. So when the Chrystia Freeland or whoever shows up at the next premiers meeting and says, hey guys, I got $30 billion for a new plan for childcare. Can you help me out? They'll say, sure, as soon as you give us what we need for health care. That's where that quid pro quo, I'm certain, is going to happen, and it may gum up Freeland's aspirations on daycare. And then there's another national plan that the Liberals sort of have bubbling under, pharmacare. There's about 4 paragraphs on pharmacare in this budget, and all they're saying is we'll continue to talk to the provinces about a national pharmacare program. Now, why is that important? Because this is a Trudeau minority government. They need one party to support this in order to get it through and avoid a general election. I'm looking at the New Democrats, most likely to deal here, and they've been crying for pharmacare. And they're going to look at this and say, where the heck is any movement on pharmacare? And it's not in here. So that may be an issue, more national programs. Other things not in here, there is no tax on the wealthy. Something else New Democrats had wanted. They want to get rid of billionaires. That's New Democrats. They certainly want to tax them. There is no new income taxes on the wealthy, though there are new taxes on luxury goods. So Robin, if you were thinking of buying that new yacht for the season or a private aircraft, you will pay a little bit extra to the government for the pleasure.
I just do not have the salary for that, but thank you so much for your update on that. David Aiken in Ottawa. Let's bring in Sahir Khan with the Institute of Fiscal and International Studies. Sahir, it feels like we are bleeding red. Those were big numbers for a deficit. Did it give you heart palpitations?
Well, I think that there's no question that it's a big budget. As David said, it's 700 plus pages. It's a lot of spending. But I think we take a step back. We think, is it broadly fiscally sustainable? And the answer is yes. As David noted, it does depend on interest rates continue to stay low, but at their current rates. But it is broadly sustainable. I think the thing that got me kind of thinking about this is really what are we going to get for the money? And I think if we're going to pass on this amount of debt to the next generation, the issue is what are they getting for it? Are they getting a better labor force, better trained, better labor force participation, a bigger labor force? Are they getting high quality infrastructure? Are they getting innovation agenda that really builds the next generation of companies and entrepreneurs? If we are able to do that, if the government's able to do that and demonstrate results, then at least there's a legacy that's been purchased with that deficit financing. If it's transfers or really poor results, then I think they're going to be competing in the global economy with one hand tied behind their back.
So what are the risks that the Liberal government has by setting out with this budget?
Well, I think it's really about implementation. It's about getting results. Every time you make a pivot, and some have said this is transformational, it is at least on the childcare side. I think you've already highlighted the difficulties of Fed-Prov negotiations and trying to get agreements in place that allow this to actually achieve a result for average Canadians. On the other hand, you've also got all these innovation programs, you've got infrastructure, you have a big commitment on the Indigenous infrastructure side as well and well-being. Those have to be successful. We have to get a result for those, and I have not yet seen kind of the transmission mechanism between the big statements in this budget and the very real fiscal allocations and the performance frameworks that will help Canadians understand whether these are achieving results. We still don't know if the first investment in superclusters has been successful, and we're kind of doubling down on them. That's not a problem in and of itself, but it can be a problem. And any government that kind of shows up having to inherit the results of all this spending is going to be saddled with the question of whether those results were achieved, whether we had good value for money. And that's, I think, the big test for this government.
We're not even out of the woods, though. This pandemic is far from over. What kind of stimulus spending do we need?
Well, I think the third wave in Ontario kind of illustrated that we're not out of the woods. And there really isn't going to be an economic recovery without a public health recovery. I think the budget wisely framed its first chapter saying about the pandemic. And actually, you could see how much of the fiscal resources were actually consumed by continuing to support the response and the recovery. So that started to eat into the available room that the government could have used for some of its transformational initiatives, kind of limiting it to just a handful of signature measures. But we're not out of this, and I think the measures to support workers, retraining, small businesses are all going to be important to kind of ensure that the scarring of this recession are kind of overcome. And that scarring has been unevenly felt. There are people that have really been unaffected by this recession and continue to work from home and earn a paycheck. And there are others that haven't been working and others that are finding that their skills are less relevant today. So the budget goes a long way to addressing some of that scarring and starts to set the tone for what the economy needs to do, or what the government and Canadians need to do for the post-pandemic economy. And before, we're going to have this kind of glucose sugar surge of pent-up spending. It's going to boost the economy over the next year and a half. But after that, we risk kind of getting back to that longer-term stagnation that was characterized by 1.5% to 2% of annual growth. These measures introduced in the budget are designed to try to target that anemic growth and get us to kind of a bigger economy, a stronger economy, which should refill coffers of the federal government. But if they're not successful, then we're just going to have more deficit, more debt, and that's why the performance really matters.
And what about the green economy? There was a lot of talk about that and concerns that it would alienate provinces like Alberta.
Well, I think there's kind of a balanced approach here. While there's a carbon tax that's now kind of gotten the stamp of approval from the Supreme Court, we also see a number of initiatives in this budget that are helping to transition the economy towards kind of that net zero economy. So incentives for companies, carbon capture and storage, things that actually would appeal to people, just economic strategies in Alberta that are kind of gearing towards this kind of post-fossil fuel economy. And we are with fossil fuels for a while, so I don't think we should pretend that that age is over. But I think we're at the beginning of that pivot to a more diversified economy in Alberta. And there are measures here that would be supportive of such a strategy in Alberta.
All right, Sahir Khan in Ottawa, thank you so much for your time. We're going to bring in Daryl Bricker now, the CEO of Ipsos. Daryl, you've been gauging the pulse of this nation, and there was talk of potentially a federal election. Where's that at now?
Well, I don't think it's anywhere. It's going to be difficult for any of the major opposition parties to vote against this, especially the NDP. And as long as they have one party that's prepared to vote for what the government's proposing in its budget, then we don't have an election forced by the opposition.
But how's this minority government going to hang on to power then? It's been 2 years since the election.
Well, I think that what's going to happen is that this budget is going to pass, and that we'll trundle our way through the rest of this pandemic until we get into the fall. And I think for at least between now and I would say that Labor Day, the likelihood that we're going to have an election is fairly remote.
There's no real appetite, though, among Canadians, despite having those provincial elections across the country.
Well, about half of us say that we want to have an election, but that half that says they want an election are actually people who want to vote against the government. They're opposition parties. So I don't know that the political environment at the moment really is favorable to an election, particularly when people are also telling us that they think an election would be both unsafe for the people who are voting and potentially unfair for the democratic process.
Let's talk about the numbers that are at play here. That's a pretty big deficit and a pretty big debt. How will Canadians feel about that?
Well, Canadians do feel right now that the government needs to be spending in order to deal with the situation that we find ourselves in as a result of the pandemic. So that part of it, I think, will be pretty well regarded by the public, particularly if the aid is direct and personal and short term. The longer term elements of this and the government continuing to ramp up its spending when we also know that Canadians maintain a very clear concern about things like the deficit and the size of the deficit means that there's some vulnerability in this. But for the short term, I think the response will be relatively positive. But for the longer term initiatives, it'll be a bit of a harder sell.
Leading up to this budget, there was all this talk about childcare, and Chrystia Freeland has said that she's going to designate some money for that, but it's a complicated plan, and it's not going to happen right away.
Yeah, I think one of the assumptions is that everybody's pro-childcare, national child care program. There is a section of the population that certainly believes in it, but it tends to be a more controversial policy than I think a lot of observers tend to understand. There's a lot of people who are wondering why it is that we need a national childcare program. And one of the things that I didn't see in the budget today was the reason for why we're doing this. And I think that if we're going to be asking the public to spend an awful lot of money on this, particularly as we know that they're concerned about the deficit, then we're going to have to come up for with a good reason for doing this. And that's something that the Minister of Finance, I think, is going to be challenged on.
Daryl, what about the Green Recovery Plan and the risk to alienating provinces like Alberta?
Well, it's not just the province of Alberta. There's a substantial constituency within the Canadian population that says, you know, anything that we can do in order to recover the economy should be on the table. So, you know, picking parts of the economy that you want to recover over other parts of the economy that you may not want to recover, if that's the message that's being sent, there are parts of the province, but also parts of the country and specific provinces, but, you know, parts of the population more generally that might find that a little bit difficult to deal with. So again, you know, communications issue here. We've seen the announcement. Let's see what the government decides to roll out in terms of its post-budget communications and how it's prepared to answer those questions.
There's been a lot of criticism towards Justin Trudeau and the rollout of the vaccine, the way the economy has been going with this pandemic. But there's also criticism that he's also acting like has a majority government. What do you think about that?
Well, honestly, he pretty much does. I mean, if he can get one of the opposition parties to vote for him on just about anything that he proposes, then he's operating pretty much like a majority government. Yes, you know, there's some things that they have to deal with in terms of committee and some other issues, but overall, what is the thing that the government has proposed that they haven't been able to follow through on if it was, you know, a piece of legislation over the space of the last year and a bit since they were reelected? And the answer is nothing. Everything that they've proposed is passed.
Daryl, always so great to chat with you. We're going to go back to Chrystia Freeland now and listen in on her budget.
100,000 Canadians out of poverty and will expand by 1 million people, the Canadians we support. I think that is great for Canadian workers. I have to say, I think that's something my mother, were she still alive, would support too.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for now. The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are unprecedented times, and today we have the biggest spending budget in Canadian history. But this budget comes far too late. It is this federal government's first budget in well over 2 years.
And there you have it, the first budget in 2 years and Chrystia Freeland's first budget as Finance Minister. That's all the time we have now for Budget 2021. Be sure to watch Global National tonight for the latest. I'm Robin Gill. Thank you so much for watching.
And my fear is that Canadians will be profoundly disappointed. Now, to be sure, there appear to be a number of positive measures in this budget, especially those that continue to support Canadians in their time of need as they struggle to make it through to the end of the pandemic. And we will carefully review and analyze them to see whether they are sufficient to help our country through this difficult time and to secure our long-term future. So far, I'm not encouraged, but we will have more to say in the days ahead. Until then, and until tomorrow, I move that the debate be now adjourned.
Mr. Fass, seconded by Mr. Dalton, moves that the debate be now adjourned. Conformément à l'article 83.2 du règlement, la motion est réputée adoptée et la Chambre demeure ajournée jusqu'à demain à 10 heures.
Adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.